All right, well, good evening again. As you can see, we're leaving behind our study of the prophet Amos. We covered a lot of material that directs us to see how God was dealing with the people of Israel, especially with the things that Amos the prophet said. But we're moving on, and as you notice, Brother Taylor does not follow the order necessarily that the books are in the Old Testament. So we're jumping around a little bit. And the next one that he takes a look at here is Hosea. Hosea, H-O-S-E-A. We do encourage everyone to participate, stay up with us, ask questions, make comments if you have some. Also, those that are watching the recorded lesson, we thank you for tuning into it. And if you will, please let us know if you have any questions here by putting comments onto our YouTube comments section where we have the recorded lesson. From what you see in your course book, we find that, a lot of times the way that we get some insight about the people we're talking about very often relates to their name. So does anybody have an idea? Let's see if we can get that page to turn there. Does anybody have an idea about Hosea's name? What does it mean and how does it relate to the things that we're going to be studying? Anyone? Okay. His name means a lot of different things depending on the context, I think, but it can mean help. It can mean deliverance. Some make it more formal and say God is salvation. So he has something to do with helping understand salvation or helping people to approach salvation or deliverance. And you could look at that as a physical thing, like with the actual kingdom of Judah and Israel, or you could look at it as a spiritual deliverance dealing with the kingdom of God. All right. So the name Hosea actually is one that's not mentioned much, except there's a king with a very similar name. It's the king Hosea. And from what I could tell, it's not the same name, but it comes from the same root. So a little bit later, we'll see that there is a king with that same name. But as we look at these points under A, the name itself, there's under number 1, it says the translation is different in English and Hebrew, but it's the same as that of the king of Israel, the last king that we'll be studying, which is called Hosea. From the Baker's Pictorial Bible Dictionary, there's this definition. It says the name Hosea means salvation. His prophetic ministry was an attempt to see Israel delivered from sin and brought back to proper relationship with God. Well, think about it. Is that any different from the message of any of the other prophets that we've been studying? We've studied prophets now all the way from Elijah and Elisha, all the way through the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. How, if any, does Hosea's message differ from that of everybody else that was a prophet? You're right. No difference. It's the same message, isn't it? Because prophets were that type of individual. They were those selected by God to let the people know what they had to do to get right with God. And part of the prophet's job was to encourage people to turn away from sin and turn back to God, and to try to get them to do so before it was too late. So that's kind of a common thread that all prophets would do. Sometimes we say that prophets were motivators. They had to motivate the people. Sometimes they did it with kind words and love, and sometimes they just hammered on the people and said, you're going to face destruction if you don't change. But their message was always that same thing. Let's talk about where Hosea did his work. We're told up here in part 2 of this, or B of this section, that he was a prophet of the northern kingdom. Now, the northern kingdom would be the 10 tribes of the north called Israel. Let's back up to the one before this, the prophet Amos that we just finished studying. Who or whom did Amos prophesy to? Remember? You got two choices, Judah or Israel.
Judah.
Nope.
No?
Amos prophesied, he lived down in Judah, remember? But because he traveled selling sheep and wool and stuff, he prophesied to the folks of Israel. So that's okay, though. It gets a little confusing when you start talking about all these different prophets talking to people in different places. But here's the thing about Hosea. As we will find out, he probably did live in Israel. Amos did not. He made his travels up in there for business, but God sent him to preach to Israel. Hosea here is a prophet of the northern kingdom, all right. And I'm sorry, I need to turn the page for the folks on the recording. He was a prophet of the northern kingdom, and what we find is that his addresses, the things that he addressed in his messages, were occupied with the northern tribes, and they seem to have a real intimate knowledge of the northern kingdom. When Hosea writes, it's as though he really knows what's going on up there. Let's look at some of the passages that are listed there. If you can see on the screen, we're talking about in the book of Hosea now. Let's take a moment and just turn together to chapter 5. And the first verse there gives us a little bit of a hint. And sometimes what you have to do is think like Brother Taylor was thinking. When he read this, he was thinking, well, these statements that the prophet makes are indicating that he's pretty familiar with Israel. So, like chapter 5 and verse 1, he says, "Hear this, O priests. Take heed, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king, for yours is the judgment." He says, because you have been a snare to Mizpah and a net spread on Tabor. Okay, he's using the term Israel here, and he's talking about priests and the religious things that they're going away from God with. So that's an indicator that he had some pretty good connections with the people of Israel. Just turn the page a little bit, chapter 6 and verses 8 and 9. Some of what he uses in his message is the names of places that people in Israel would be more familiar with, not so the folks of Judah. For example, here he says, "Gilead is a city of evildoers and defiled with blood. As bands of robbers lie in wait for a man, so the company of priests murder on the way to Shechem. Surely they commit lewdness." So there's a couple of names of places. Shechem and Gilead were up there in the northern kingdom. They were up in what we'd probably call Galilee today. But that's an indication that he was primarily focusing on things that the people would be familiar with. We also notice chapter 12 and verse 12, which says, speaking here about people that were, familiar with the people of Israel. Jacob fled to the country of Syria. Okay, Syria, remember, is up in the north, and they'd be the ones that would be dealing with the people of Israel. Israel served for a spouse, and for a wife he tended sheep. That's just some information about Jacob. Remember, he worked for his wives tending sheep. All right, and then the last one he lists there is chapter 14 and verse 6. This writing here only has 14 chapters, and verse 6 says, "His branches shall spread, his beauty shall be like an olive tree, and his fragrance like Lebanon." Okay, where was Lebanon compared to the other places? It was in the north, wasn't it? So all these places that he mentions are north. They're up there in the area where Israel would be. All right, so that's the point here, that what he says or what he addresses was those things that would be very familiar to the people of Israel. And then the point right under that one says, he also makes reference to our land and our king in his prophecy to the north. And those verses there just kind of bring that up. When he writes about the kingdom, it's kind of like, this is ours. I'm part of this. And so that indicates that not only was he writing to the Israelites in the northern kingdom, but he probably was a resident of that kingdom too. So he would be also in that group. And the point right under this one also mentions that he characteristically refers to Israel by the name of its largest tribe, which was what? This right here will tell us, but does anybody remember the largest tribe? Ephraim, that's right. Ephraim occupied more of the northern kingdom than anybody else. And so when Hosea speaks of Ephraim, that's a reference to the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes. Okay? And when he does that, that maybe even more points to him not being just an Israelite, but an Ephraimite, that he would have been from that place too. So let's take a quick look there. That's from chapter 4 and verse 17. If you'll turn back a few pages there. Chapter 4 and verse 17. He says, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Okay? Ephraim is joined to idols. He speaks as though he knows this people of Ephraim. And also chapter 5, verses 3 through 5 thereabouts, he says, I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. From now, O Ephraim, you commit harlotry. Israel is defiled. They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore, Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Notice this, Judah also stumbles with them. That's an interesting sidebar that he takes there. He says, not only do Israel and Ephraim have this problem here of going away from God, but he said, I noticed it in Judah as well. And we know that's what's coming next. After the people of Israel are taken captives and no longer exist, then the next thing that happens is the march of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They come and they take Judah as well. Any thoughts or questions about this so far? I know this is kind of dry to start with. It's just sort of putting us in the place so we know sort of what Hosea was like. Point 4 under there tells us that he was a contemporary of whom? Whom was he a contemporary? Of whom was he a contemporary? Well, Amos, of course, right? They didn't write at exactly the same time, but they were in the same general point in history. But here's a little bit of a difference. If you look underneath there, and I think I didn't mean to do that. Let's see. Let me try to back up on that one. Okay. If you look under point number 4 there, well, okay. It's not going to put a line up there, I guess. Trying to turn the page. But let's just look at this for a moment. Here's what Brother Taylor aptly points out. He says, as a prophet, he was a contemporary of Amos, whereas Amos denounced the social inequalities of his day and the exploitation of the lower classes. Remember, that's what Amos preached about. He said, you all that are having ease in Zion, you all that are resting on your luxurious couches and all, you're to be condemned because of the way you treat the poor and the lower classes. And that was much of what Amos's message was about. Well, now he says Hosea was primarily concerned with the political and religious and moral evils of the nation. Kind of like the big picture of the evils of the nation as far as they went with God. Now, I mean, you can see that they both kind of overlap. They were both prophets who talked about the same thing in a sense, but Amos was more towards their social ills, and Hosea seems to be more about their national problems. Okay? So we'll kind of keep an eye out for that as we go along. That's from the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible. Now, remember that Amos had another job, didn't he? When we studied Amos just before, Amos served as a shepherd, raised sheep, and what else did he do? Yeah, he was a fig gatherer, sycamore figs. Okay. Well, with Hosea, though, we don't know anything. We don't know what his occupation was. We don't know how he made a living or anything. So that's a little bit of a bare spot there. We don't know that much about his personal life. Okay. Any questions there or comments? So let's move into something much more personal about Hosea. We can get this thing to turn the page right. Now, here we go. We do know this. We know that his father, just a moment, let me turn that page again. His father was a gentleman named Beeri. It's not beer, but B-E-R-I. It's 3 syllables. So Beeri was his father. Chapter 1 tells us that. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri. I think the E has the emphasis, doesn't it? The long E, so it's Beeri. Try to grip these things. They're tough. All right. And his wife, we know her name, don't we? We'll come to that in just a moment. Verse 3, his wife was Gomer. We normally associate that with more of a male name, but it doesn't have to be. Gomer was her name, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. All right. And she was the daughter of Diblaim. If you know how to pronounce that, you're doing better than me. Diblaim, I think, might be closer to it. Anyway, we know something about these people and his family. Now, the real gist of this whole book is what we learn next. Hosea was the husband of Gomer, but Gomer was not your usual spouse. What was unusual about Gomer's background? Anybody know? Yeah, it says here Gomer was a harlot. He was the son of Beeri and husband of Gomer. And here it is, Gomer was a wife of harlotry. Let's look at that. That's from verse 2. When the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. All right. Now, if you've read ahead some, this is going to become a focus for what the rest of the whole book is about. We're going to see that Hosea's relationship with his wife is very similar to the relationship that Israel had with God. And you think, well, wait a minute. Israel, were they harlots? Did they take on that nature? Well, yeah, in a sense, they sure did. And we're going to see some of that as we go along. But let's look a little bit more at the personal nature of Hosea's life here. It says, she bore him 2 sons and a daughter, whose God-given names represented different aspects of God's relationship to Israel. All right, well, we're going to look at the names of these children on the next screen, so we're not going to go into that right now in greater detail. But you can find out about these children when you start looking in verse 4. Verse 4 of the first chapter, the Lord said to him, it just says in verse 3, she bore him a son, and now the Lord says to him what to call him, and the Lord gives him an explanation there about the name of that first son. And then if you go down a little farther to verse 6 of the first chapter, here's the daughter. She conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord tells him what to call her and an explanation. In fact, if we look at the meanings of the names, we're going to see that they relate somewhat to Israel and the things that they were doing. Okay? So we'll come to that in the next section that we get to. But let's leave it at that for a moment. Here, Gomer, his wife, is from harlotry. She has practiced as a harlot, but he married her. And notice that it was at God's insistence. Did you catch that in verse 2? God tells him, go and take yourself this wife. So it's important that we know God is instructing Hosea about how to go about this. So he goes and he takes this wife, and then, as if, there's more to the story, under part 2 there on your lesson guide, right here, she was unfaithful to Hosea. Right here, part 2, she became unfaithful to him. Gomer left Hosea and played the harlot with many different lovers. Well, you might think, what kind of a sordid tale is going on here? What modern sitcom writer wrote this script here? That's what it sounds like. But we're going to see how it plays out, because there's probably a word for it in literature where you have a whole picture of events and a whole story that mirrors something else. That's an allegory, maybe? I don't know. I slept through that part of English. But there is some terms for it. But here's the picture, though. What happens with Hosea and his wife, and her departing from him, and playing the harlot again, and then she comes back. Notice verse 3 under there, or point 3. Hosea was instructed again by God. Oops, I've gone too far, but that's all right. We're looking at point 3. Hosea was then instructed to buy her back and love her again. Well, that's rather unusual, but look at chapter 3. And this is after we're told about the children that she bore. And then when she goes away from him, chapter 3, and I think it's verse 1, we get this explanation here. Then the Lord said to me, this is Hosea speaking first person. The Lord said to me, go again. Love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. Okay? So what he's doing here, God is instructing Hosea to go and take this wife back. In fact, he has to buy her back. And when that happens, then he said that's what God is doing with Israel. Okay? Verse 2 says, so I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1 1/2 homers of barley. I don't know what value that is, but that's a lot. She was a person of some value. 15 shekels of silver is no small sum, and I guess a homer and a half of barley is a pretty good chunk of barley too. But he had to pay a price to get her back. And love her again, just as he did at the beginning. Verse 3, this is what Hosea tells her. To her, you shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be toward you. All right, so this relationship that he's establishing here when he takes her back is true and correct and real. It's not just, he's not just playing some game here with God directing him. It's a real act of devotion on his part, and the vows that he makes are true. And then he explains, for the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. And afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Well, now we know that when Israel was captured by the Assyrians, they kind of ceased to be as a nation, as a kingdom. But individuals among them were out there in the world. And later on, after the captivity of Judah, many people came back to Judah, and it's likely that some of those original Israelites were out there too that may have come back and taken part in this reestablishing of that kingdom. But there's the other part to the story. So, any thoughts or comments or questions about that? Has this piqued our interest a little bit? Like to know what happens next, how this turns out, and what's going on here? How did God manage to choose this particular picture to show God's love for Israel? One last thing, we've got a couple of minutes left, and please take a look there at number 4 on the list. It says that this bitter tragedy did something for Hosea that nothing but suffering and sorrow can do. Now, you just think about that. Did you reckon that Hosea experienced some suffering and sorrow? You would think so, after all that his wife did to put him through. And now it says here, this experience enabled him to understand something of God's immeasurable love for his people. It enabled him to plead with the people effectively to return to their God who loved them. I mean, sometimes it takes a really unique story to get people's attention. And here, this prophet's going to come along and lay his whole life bare and say, yes, I had a wife who was a harlot, and she left me and played the harlot with others, and I went and I took her back. And I love her just like I loved her at the beginning. Whew, that's going to get some people's attention. And then he will be able to say, look, God feels the same way about you. And they might back up and say, oh, wait a minute, we're not that kind of people. Don't go calling us harlots, but they were, weren't they? When you leave God and go somewhere else, that's leaving your love and going and making adulterous relationships in a spiritual way. And they were guilty of that. And so Hosea had to be able to picture them enough that they'd understand that. And then as we end this page right here, we'll stop here. Hosea had a real compassion for his people. This is from Nelson's Book of Bible stuff. He says, Hosea had a real compassion for his people, and his personal suffering did what? Because of the behavior his wife gave him, it gave him insight into God's grief over Israel's sin. Thus his words of coming judgment are passionate but tempered with a heart of tenderness. So I think we're off to a good start here. We begin to see this prophet in a little different light. He's not like Amos, who just blasted into those cities of the northern tribes and said, you guys better straighten up or here's what's going to happen to you. And not only you, but the people around you are all going to be destroyed. And, now here comes Hosea with a totally different approach. And I like that. We'll see how that turns out. So if you will, in your course book, mark number 2 there, the date. And we'll start on that next time. We'll get the information about the date of the writing of the letter, and we'll go from there. Thanks for your attention. I didn't leave much time for comments, and I'm sorry, but we'll have more substantial things to discuss when we get back to this later. And for the folks who are watching the recorded version, thank you for tuning in. If you have questions or comments about this, please leave the comments on our comments section on the YouTube page, and it will be there if you want to go back and review any of the lessons we've done. Those things stay recorded on YouTube for eons, for centuries. They're there forever, I guess, as long as YouTube exists. So you can go back and review these anytime you like, and so can the folks who are attending the class in person as well. But thank you for joining us for this class.